Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Today I'm joined by Elizabeth MacDuffie. She's the editor-in-chief of Meat for Tea, the Valley Review, which was founded by herself and Alexandra Wagman. Meat for Tea is a non-academic affiliated magazine committed to recognizing and featuring the work of the artists, writers, and musicians living in Western Massachusetts and beyond, and they also have a podcast.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. It's wonderful to have you on the show. I'm going to get started with who or what inspired you to go into the creative arts?
I don't think anything did. I don't remember a time in my life when I wasn't inclined in that direction. Even when was I 5? I made a little book called Cat and Mouse with pictures on each page. Like, this is cat, this is mouse. And the last page is cat and mouse are friends, with my illustrations all folded. And I was like, look, Mommy, I made a book. And even as young as 3, I would just leap around the house, and I yelled and screamed about needing ballet lessons. So it wasn't long after that I got them, because I browbeat my parents so hard. And the same thing happened with piano lessons when I was like 3 or 4. I need a piano. And I guess I just failed to shut up about it. And by the time I was 6, there was a piano in the house. It feels like it must be kind of innate from as early as I can remember.
Nice. And then, of course, you've gone on to create a literary journal. What inspired you to do that?
Well, that's another thing that goes back a long time. When I was an undergrad, my sophomore year in college, I was assistant editor on my university's literary arts and literary journal. And then I was editor-in-chief. And then I was chair of the board of student publications. And then when I was working on my master's degree, I sat on the editorial board of a women's literary journal. So it seems like there's this natural evolution. And then Meat for Tea was very directly inspired by Alexandra Wagman. We were both adjunct faculty in the English department at Holyoke Community College. And one day while we were both just sitting in the office grading student papers, Alex turned to me and said, we should start a literary journal. And I said, oh, okay, let's do that then. And that was it. It was just that simple in-office conversation over grading student papers.
That's lovely. Did you ever think it would sort of snowball into what it's become now?
Maybe I have a lot of hubris. I think I just always kind of expected to make it into something important. I think when I embark upon things, that's what I expect them to become, which might not be realistic, but it drives me for sure.
Well, that's okay to have high expectations and believe in yourself. I mean, that's how things get done.
It works.
Can you tell the listeners a little bit more about your Meat for Tea and the podcast as well?
Yeah. One thing they might be curious about is the name, I imagine, because maybe people listening to the podcast right now are hearing Meat for Tea, the hominin, and thinking, oh, how sweet. Yes, let's meet for tea. Can we have biscuits with our tea? And it's MEAT. So the way that all started is way, way back in the days of MySpace. A fellow attempted to ask me out, and he sent me via MySpace Messenger an invitation to meet for tea. And he spelled it exactly like that. So I was an English professor. He did not get the date. But I looked at the words as they lay on the page, and I really liked how they looked and how they almost skew palindrome. And initially I took that phrase, and it was a band very briefly. I played keys. And then bass player in the band moved to Rhode Island. Drummer moved to Brooklyn, New York. I was still in Western Mass, so there goes the band. So on the fateful day when Alex Wagman turned me in the office and asked if I wanted to start the literary journal, I said, I've got a name, and told her to her, and she's like, oh, great. And she's like, okay, colon. When we first started it was colon, the Northampton Review, because we both lived in Northampton, Mass. And then I moved out of Northampton, Mass into other parts of the area and figured the Valley Review would be more representative of what it truly is. So there, in a nutshell, is that. And the podcast, we just started that 2 years ago. I'm like asking my husband. I think it's been 2 years now. Yeah, I had the idea to do that about 4 years ago because we have release parties for each issue of my quarterly publication. And there's art on exhibit, there's films, there's spoken word, there's live music. They're gala events. And my husband live recorded the audio from those. So we had all these archives and archives of really great spoken word and live music recordings. And we were going to do a compilation CD or something, and then it dawned on us both at about the same time, hey, this is a lot of material for a podcast.
That's wonderful. Where do you sort of see both the journal and the podcast going in the new year?
Hopefully just more of the same in terms of the podcast, but bigger with a larger listenership, maybe with more dedicated listeners buying themselves lots of lovely Meat for Tea merchandise at our Teespring shop. In addition to the journal and the podcast, we also have a chapbook press too. So, and we've been a little bit inactive on that, so to get more chapbooks out there too.
Wonderful.
But more of the same, just maybe a larger scale, maybe with more of a paycheck. Everyone knows how rich podcasters who don't do true crime podcasts get.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, I could never handle the true crime thing.
I like listening to them. It's just, it would be, given all the audio material I have related to Meat for Tea, it would be kind of silly for me to do that.
Taking a step back and getting to know you a little bit more, what is a piece of writing advice that you ignore and a piece of writing advice that you always follow?
What writing advice do I ignore? Do I ignore all advice? The best writing advice, as far as always follow, is whatever you do, write every day. Whether it's just a paragraph in your journal describing what you feel, whether it's what you cooked for dinner the night before, just write something every day, whether it's recording your dreams. Preferably it's all of those things, but always be writing. Always be writing. I don't remember ever being exposed to any really bad writing advice. I think someone who gave himself really bad writing advice was Ernest Hemingway, because he would rework a sentence. Oh, God, he said once he reworked a sentence, was it 32 times before he would commit it to the page and call it good enough? And we know how he ended up. So I think beating yourself up and editing while you're in a process of producing a draft, that's a recipe for disaster.
Oh, I've been down that path many times.
It's an easy one to go down. I don't know if you're familiar with the name Peter Elbow. He was my dissertation chair at UMass. He's kind of a household name. He wrote Writing with Power and Writing Without Teachers. Strongly recommend both those books. But he talks about the need to shut up your inner editor while you're just getting your words on paper and just to free write. And he says that inner editor is stubborn and insistent and really wants you to stop writing. And you just have to ignore it. So there you go. There's your succinct answer. What's the worst writing advice I ever heard? It's from my own inner editor. That's the one you've got to ignore.
It's certainly very tough, very tough.
Yeah. You just have to keep your hand moving across the page and keep the words coming. I recommend writing longhand too.
I don't know if my hand could handle that. Cramp up after a while.
Shake it out.
Right.
You play piano?
I do, yeah.
So the same thing happens. Like, I don't know if you use the hand and virtuoso exercises. Gold standard, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just to keep your technique up. Well, sometimes when you're doing those, you can get a little crampy.
True that.
Shake it out. Also, Bach has no mercy.
Oof, not at all.
No mercy. Left hand, right hand, equally as much demanded of them.
I lucked out, though. I'm a left-handed person.
Do you think that makes Bach easier? Maybe
To an extent. It certainly made playing violin easier. So.
Oh, wow.
At least I think so.
I'm terrible. I tried playing bass for a while, and I'm so used to the piano fingers that even on the bass strings, I had my hand in that curl, which is great for that. So no strings. Maybe I'll take it up again.
Back to books a little bit. What was a book that you absolutely loved as a child that had an effect on you in your life?
There's so many, all of them. I mean, Little Women. My favorite, though, was probably The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler by E.L. Konigsberg. And I didn't run away and spend an overnight in the Metropolitan Museum of Art or anything like that, but it just had a larger effect, just this effect of wanting to spend time in museums and just appreciate those ancient works. And of course, you read the book as a child too. Oh, it's one of my favorites. Claudia is such a role model. She's so great. But, there's always that dream of well, maybe I'll find a sculpture that's actually a Michelangelo in my backyard or in the woods or somewhere too. So, yeah, it's one of my all-time favorites.
It's a good one for sure. One of those classics.
E.L. Konigsberg was wonderful. She's kind of feminist. If you think about her female characters, they were really strong.
True.
Right? Mm-hmm. Claudia didn't take much guff.
If you could be any fictional character, who would it be? Do you think it would be Claudia or maybe somebody else?
Mrs. Basil Frankweiler. She was hella rich.
Well, I can't beat that, right?
She had the art collection and all of her files. Maybe they were mixed up. Yeah, I would be her, and I would organize those files. I find card cataloging and stuff like that very soothing.
There's definitely something soothing for having things in a nice order.
There's something also, if you're having any kind of anxiety about anything, you have to be careful because it can turn into a procrastination technique. But alphabetizing and categorizing your albums or your books is just so methodical and mindful.
And speaking of the creative process, do you have a favorite part or even a least favorite part?
Obviously, done is a good part.
Oh, yes.
I made it. It's done. Look at it. Here it is. That's a really good part. It depends. For visual arts, I'm just sinking in and just making the piece can feel really good. I think it just depends on my mood and the moment, because it can go either way. And I've had it happen with composing music, with visual art, with writing. It can be kind of torturous for a while, and then you can move into a flow. It can be torturous the whole time, but you end up with something good. Or it can come out unfettered. And I wish I could control the conditions that determine which one of those it is. So I guess all the time, my favorite part is done.
Do you ever get that sort of melancholy that happens when you are finished with a product?
Nope. I think one preventative to that is, for instance, Meat for Tea. That's like getting on a merry-go-round that's going ever and ever faster. It's a quarterly publication. And some people will run into me at a release party, back when we were doing things in public and gathering with each other, and say, wow, it must feel really good to have the new issue out. I bet now's time for you to relax. Well, actually, no. Now's time to start on the mountain of shipping out contributors' party copies and getting the new issue out to distribution points, and it starts up again. So it could be I just created a system where I just don't have that melancholy.
That's probably a good thing.
I feel like it's a lucky thing, but it's been really nice just to have this rabbit hole that I have to descend into, where I am doing nothing more than looking at art and reading poetry and reading short fiction and determining which is good enough to make the cut and be included in the content of Meat for Tea. And it's kind of delicious just to be able to sink down into that and have that be the thing I'm meant to do. And it doesn't mean I'm cutting off everything that's going on in the world. I certainly wouldn't do that, but it's a respite.
Being creative and getting your hands dirty with creative projects definitely is so life-bringing.
Or your brain dirty if all you're doing is reading stuff. Yes.
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 And speaking of reading, what is a book that you've read recently that challenged you and one that inspired you?
Derek Wolcott's Omeros, which is translation. It's done kind of in Afro-Caribbean poetry of the Odyssey. Actually, I was reading it with a book group I'm in, and we didn't make it all the way through it. We all put it down. The female characters were kind of props. They weren't very fleshed out. And then we got word that he was yet another one who'd had some hashtag Me Too reports. So that was disappointing. We were like, you know what, buddy, we're just not going to keep reading your book. Sorry. So that one was challenging. What's the most inspiring book I've read? You know, Lydia Yuknevich's The Book of Joan.
I have not heard of that.
It's pretty famous. It won a lot of big prizes. Oh, Girl, Woman, Other. And can I look up her name really fast? I'm forgetting. It's brilliant. Yeah, Bernardine Evaristo, 2019 release. Absolutely just stunning. I don't know that the contents of the book inspired me to be one way or the other, but the writing and the style of writing inspired me to try things on in my writing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I always find it fascinating, like what books stick with people when they're on the podcast, and it's such a wide variety.
I read so many too. And then, I mean, between being, another really important one though. See, like I said, too many. I'm reading work of nonfiction by Jessie Daniels called Nice White Ladies, which I think should be required reading for anybody trying to really do anti-racism training on themselves and on their communities. So that's the one I'm currently reading. That's really it's a tough read. It really forces you to confront a lot of things even as a white girl in one's upbringing where you don't think you've been part of institutional racism, but whether you want to be or not, you sort of have unconsciously been.
It sounds like a very important read, especially nowadays.
It's so important. Yeah, I would prescribe it to everybody.
There's a lot of, I think, hard truths sometimes when it comes to bettering ourselves across the board.
Yep.
And sometimes we have to just be ready for whatever comes.
I agree.
It sounds like you read, quite a wide variety of books, but if you had to pick one absolute favorite of all time, do you have one of those?
You know, MFK Fisher's The Art of Eating, it's not just food writing, it's some of the most glorious, gorgeous prose ever. It's just stunning. More people should know about MFK Fisher. I mean, there's so many. Toni Morrison's Beloved, Louise Erdrich's The Beat Queen. Too many. I read too much.
Oh, I don't think there's such a thing as too much.
I read a lot. Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with MFK Fisher's The Art of Eating, or the slim volume she wrote prior to that, Serve It Forth. Although having said that, my colleague and friend Jessamine Smythe just shared her arc of her recently released book, Gilgamesh Wilderness, and that's amazing. She uses the Epic of Gilgamesh to explore her grieving process over the loss of her beloved dog, also named Gilgamesh.
That sounds really interesting.
It's gorgeous. It's from Saddle Hill Press. She was on an episode of the podcast, actually, if you want to hear her talk about it and read from it.
Nice. I'll definitely have to look that up.
Yeah, she's brilliant.
Back to Meat for Tea, you're the editor-in-chief. What is a common stereotype that you hope to break with your work as editor-in-chief?
The chief one I run up against is people think that I'm independently wealthy. I think people associate, I don't understand how someone would associate editing a small literary journal with some sort of a vanity job, but I think some people do. I have a teeny tiny submission fee, and it's only because I mail out physical copies of the issue, and it averages about 135 to 150 pages.
That's big.
Yeah, right. It weighs something. So the submission fee I charge does not quite cover the postage, but keeps me somewhat in the black. I've had some interesting comments about that. So I think that's the biggest misconception, is that I'm getting rich doing this. There's an old joke actually in the publishing community. How to make a small fortune in publishing. Start with a large one. So Yep.
I think it applies to so many creative arts. We do it not for the paycheck, but because it's a passion, and we can't really live without doing something creative.
Exactly. You hear the sometimes obnoxious comment that, well, if it's something you can't stop yourself from doing, then why should you be paid for it? It's like, well, creative people need roofs over their head and food in their mouth just as much as anyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's worth our time, worth our while. Like, just because we could do it for free, we don't want to devalue the art.
Oh, you don't want to be paid in exposure?
Oof, I can't tell you how many times musicians get paid in exposure.
Oh, yes, you can. Yes, I totally.
Well, yes, you'd know.
I relate. I very much relate.
We're gonna jump into a music question. If you had intro music or a theme song for your life, what would that be?
Oh God, there's a band called Medicine. They're really, really great, actually. Yeah, I think their song "Wet on Wet" would be it. It's got a refrain. There's probably no swearing on this podcast.
Not usually.
No. Well, it's the refrain is, "You'll feel my poison if you try to F me." Only it's sung, the whole thing, that the melody and everything is so gorgeous, and it's so beautifully sung. Actually, their lead vocalist is the daughter of Bruce Lee.
Oh.
I know, right? I
didn't know he had a daughter.
And she's a singer.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful, but it's also like a warning, like a "don't mess with me" kind of anthem. And I don't know, I feel like smallish creative women in the world might need to walk around with a little bit of that attitude about us.
A little bit of a bite with the bark.
Yeah, a little bit of I wouldn't go there.
Nice, very empowering, I'm sure.
Right.
And another music-related question. I had also asked your husband, but what are some of your favorite albums or CDs that have inspired you in your life?
So many. When I was a child, when I was a little girl, I was all about classical music, Bach, and then Glenn Gould playing the French suites, which that's a thing. When I got older and was a punk rock girl, I think Patti Smith's album Easter was a big one for me. I think I drove my parents crazy, just in the living room screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm so goddamn young," at the top of my lungs. So those are a couple. And then there's one by John Lurie, his band, The Lounge Lizard, that came out, was it in 1999, called The Queen of All Ears, which is absolutely amazing. God, it's everything you want to hear. It's kind of jazz fusion, but it's kind of post-punk at the same time. And you can actually hear a lot of that music if you watch his HBO Max series, Painting with John, uses a lot of that music.
I'll have to check that out.
It's good. Yeah, we can just trade recommendations all night long.
There you go. Yeah. Yes, you and your husband's music collection is just phenomenal to even think about. So
we have a lot of books too. I'm looking at my cookbook collection behind you, and it's not even fully unpacked, and I've got over 100 cookbooks out.
Nice. It's like your own little library right there.
Oh God, once I unpack all the books, there's probably as many books as there are albums. There's probably a couple thousand. Grad school will do that, as you know. But there's some I just can't bear to part with.
Yeah. Have you ever graduated into like an e-reader or are you strictly paper books?
Early in the days of Meat for Tea, and Alex is now is she associate professor of English at Holyoke Community College. She ceased doing Meat for Tea because she had a baby and then went in different directions. We're still good friends. But early on, we refused to read things on a screen, so we'd print out everything and read it on paper. And now if I did that, I'd go broke on ink and paper. And I've done e-reader. I don't know. Meat for Tea is a physical print journal. People can buy PDFs if they want to. But I guess I like having something in my hands and turning the pages. And I actually really like the smell of offset printing. Have you ever smelled a new book? Doesn't that smell good?
It does. It does. It's its own unique scent for sure.
I have a perfume that smells kind of like that.
Really?
It's very pretty. I love it. I mean, it's not exactly only that scent. That's one of the notes, but there's definitely a note of book.
Nice. Now all the book people listening are going, okay, what is it?
It's called Zing, D-Z-I-N-G, exclamation point, and it's from L'Artisan Parfum.
Nice. I'll have to see if I can find a link to that. So one more question before we go. In your own words, what does living a creative life mean to you?
Well, chiefly, it means commitment. It means you're going to do something creative every day, whether it's how you cook your dinner, whether it's how your house is arranged, whether it's the projects. I think it's just a commitment and a dedication.
That makes sense, yeah.
It's hard for me to answer because I can't imagine the flip side. What does not living, if you ask me what does not living a creative life look like? The flip side, I'd say, well, is that what it's like to be dead?
That's a very interesting way of thinking of it.
The flip side, because to me to be alive is to be creating something. Unless you're, sitting and watching Netflix. Then you're just creating thoughts. Those count too, though.
Indeed.
Yeah.
What an interesting sentiment to end on.
Yes, I like it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being on the show. You're welcome. Listeners, please check out the show notes for links for the journal, Meat for Tea, as well as book recommendations. And if I can find it, the perfume recommendation where it smells kind of like books. As always, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.